Good afternoon to all of those who are on the East Coast, and good morning to those on the Central and West Coast time. Those watching from Europe, watching in Israel, we want to wish you a good evening. Today we have a fascinating guest, really a person who shaped modern Jewish history, and that is Dr. Jerry Berkowitz. Dr. Jerry Berkowitz and his wife of blessed memory, Rivka, and their oldest child, who at the time was 2 years old, Talia, were one of those hijacked by the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. 3 of the 4 planes where there was an attempted hijack were successful, and those planes were taken by the PFLP, landed in Jordan. Jerry's wife, Rivka, and his young daughter, at the time were held on the plane, were hostages for a week. Jerry was taken off the plane and was held as a hostage for almost a month of his life held as a hostage. We're talking 1970. We're now in 1924. And we're speaking to Jerry. Jerry, who news stations from throughout the United States, whenever there's been a hostage situation, they reach out to him because he has this incredible ability to articulate, to speak about not only what happened, but the feelings that he went through, the experience his wife went through, to give us a sense, not only what it's like to be a hostage, but really the aftermath, the impact, the rest of your life after having been a hostage. Dr. Berkowitz, if you could share with us in the first maybe 7-8 minutes, the story itself, and then at that point, if you can get into the experience and the impact in terms of what happened to you, your wife, and your daughter, going back almost 55 years ago.
Okay, so we were in Israel the summer of 1970. We had been in Israel separately as students at the same institution. And we had also been in Israel as tourists in 67, 68 in the winter, in intersession when I was teaching. And our year in Israel at the Malcolm Greenberg Institute for Teachers from Abroad had a great impact on our lives. And we seriously, my wife would only date someone who was considering Aliyah, and I certainly felt that myself. But it's different being a student or being a tourist from being someone who has to live there or is living there. So we went over, and of course we had a 2-year-old, so we were contending with diaper service and all the other kind of things, the apartment and just regular shopping and everything else. After the summer ended, I had to get back to teach on the day after Labor Day. So September 6, 1970, which was Hey Elul, we boarded a TWA plane early in the morning at Lud Airport and took off. Those days, there were no direct flights. So our plane, in fact, was a round-the-world flight starting off in the Far East. So the passengers represented the United Nations because it made a whole bunch of stops before it ever got to Israel. We were sitting in the bulkhead seats. Our plane started at a first landing in Athens and then landed in Frankfurt. Pardon me, from Frankfurt, we took off and we were flying. And suddenly a man and a woman rammed down the aisle carrying pistols and grenades, sailed past us through first class and into the cockpit. After a short time, we heard the woman say, "This is your new captain speaking. This plane has been taken over by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. We're taking you to a friendly country with friendly people." So obviously we were apprehensive, but the entire summer had been filled with hijackings. And typically a plane was flown to an Arab country. The hijackers or their organization listed terrorists who were in prison and from whatever country the plane came from, Greece, Italy, France. The prisoners were released, the plane took off. So it was all within 24 hours. Unfortunately, we had a different experience. So we were flying and we just felt, okay, I thought we were going to go to Algeria because Israel was controlling Sinai at that point, and an Algerian plane had wandered into the airspace over Sinai and was taken to airport in Israel. And there were Algerian officers on the plane, military officers, and they were taken off the plane, and the plane just went on its way back to wherever they were going, I guess, back to Algeria, I guess. So I figured, well, they could swap our plane for these guys and we'd be home, be all over. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. At a point, we felt the plane turning around and we flew for a number of hours. And then we felt the plane slowing down and we felt we were going down. My wife looked out the window and she said, "This is not an airport." So our plane landed on a World War II airstrip, which really meant it was just landing in the desert. There was no airport per se. We're landing on the sand. Great landing. All props to the captain. And when we landed, the plane was flooded by fighters from the Popular Front. They collected passports. They handed out customs declarations, which seemed very weird, but I guess they wanted to see what we had in our suitcases. So if there were some things that they wanted to get, they would get. The first day, we slept on the plane that night, and the first day, the women and children were told to leave the plane. This was a show for the International Red Cross. They went down. Of course, a lot of scenes on the plane. The women want to stay. The men want them to leave with the children, so it'll be safer. And all of a sudden, they came back. My wife said to me, "Well, whatever happens, we'll face it together." That night, I and 5 other men were taken off the plane, and we were put in a tender, a truck which has bench seats, and for some reason, they had 6 of us and they only had 5 blindfolds. So I was the guy who didn't get blindfolded, which is probably a handy thing because I probably was the only one of the 6 of us who knew where we were when we got to our destination, which was the northern headquarters of the Popular Front in the town of Irbid. I knew where Irbid was because the Israeli Air Force had attacked Irbid during the summer and strafed the streets and killed a number of people. So I wasn't looking for a welcome to Irbid party. We were taken into the northern headquarters building, which was a converted house. Did have a huge flagpole with their flag on it, which provided a target for both the Jordanian and Israeli air forces. And we were taken into the command room where we met their leader, who told us that even though he was a captain in the Syrian army, he really had no rank because they were a Marxist group. I thank Hashem, thank God every day that I was being held by a Marxist group and not by an Islamic group. So he told us to make ourselves comfortable, and we slept there that night. And the next day, we were moved across the hall into a room that I guess had been used by fighters to sleep in. The room was 12 by 12, pink and green paint scheme. And the only thing it had in it was a very narrow table, 2 chairs, a cod, a unglazed water pitcher where the warm water goes through the walls and keeps the water cold, and 1 glass for the 6 of us to share. The room in back of ours was the ammo depot, and there was a small set of, probably, I think it was a propane kitchen kind of thing for heating food. They had a fridge. There was no bathroom inside. The bathroom was outside in a shed, just consisting of a shed and a big hole in the ground. So this was going to be our home for a couple of weeks. We were an interesting collection of people. 2 of the 6 were representatives, were members of the Department of Defense. They came from Thailand to testify before Congress, and like good spies, ate their testimony on the plane as much as they could. And they, of course, were traveling with diplomatic, well, puffy passports, I call them, that indicated that you don't go through customs and do that kind of thing because it's an official American government employee passport. The third non-Jew was attached to the State Department. He'd been in Algeria and in Yemen, and he was heading for his dream post in Paris when he ended up in Irbid. In addition to myself, there were two Jews. There were Syrian brothers who had Israeli passports, in addition to their American passports. They were teachers at the Flatbush Yeshiva. So pretty much on a regular basis, they would say to me, we know why we're here, because our passports, either diplomatic passports or Israeli passports, but why are you here? And I eventually figured out that I was there to keep that I had some kind of relationship with both worlds. The Syrian Jewish community is very inclusive. It doesn't deal with the outside world very much. So they had very little experience dealing with non-Jews. And for the three non-Jews, I'm sure they had no experience dealing with Jews at all. Certainly not religious Jews. Again, this was the 5th of Elul, so this was the beginning of the penitential month for Sephardim, where they say penitential prayers every morning. We left the plane with the clothes on our back. That's it. We had the clothes on our back and nothing else. So we had no prayer books, no tefillin, no prayer shawls. And the brothers every day, every morning, got up and tried to recreate the morning penitential prayers, which I'm sure freaked out the three non-Jews. So it was not an easy situation. The two Defense Department guys, a younger guy and an older guy. The older guy was, I think, the head of the mission there, and the younger guy was, I think, his security. And it was interesting that the three Jews were along one wall because we were given two blankets, none of which had ever seen a washing machine. One to sleep on and one to cover ourselves with. Those were our accommodations. So the three Jews, I think, were in the back one wall, and the Defense Department guys were catty-cornered to each other, and the State Department guy was on the same wall with the younger guy from the Defense Department. Right after we moved into that room, we heard rifle fire, and we asked, well, so what's going on? They said, oh, it's a wedding. And I was familiar with that. In many movies or film clips, you'll see videos now. You'll see a wedding, an Arab wedding, and they fire rifles into the air, which is kind of dangerous because when it goes up, comes down, the bullets can come and hit you in the head and you die. So, okay, we accepted that as an explanation. Then we started to hear the mortar exchange going on between the Jordanians and the Palestinians. And someone said, well, I guess they didn't like the bride, which was a moment when all of us are laughing, both the guards and us, because it just struck us as very weird. So that was our introduction to life. That was the beginning of the war between the Jordanians and the Palestinians, which resulted in the death of 10,000 Palestinians. So we were sitting in the middle of it. That is, we having the Defense Department guys with us always told us if it's incoming or outgoing fire that we're hearing. And we're always conscious of the fact that if anything hit our buildings, sharing a wall with the ammo dump, we would be done, despite the Defense Department guys telling us, lie on the ground on the opposite wall from the dump, and if it gets hit and it blows up, the explosion will go over your head. I'm sure if you went to that house, you could see my fingernail scratchings on the floor, waiting for the bombardments to stop. We just settled in and trying to accommodate each other, which was not an easy thing. At one point, In the beginning of the war between the Palestinians and Jordanians, the Palestinians had the upper hand. The Jordanians were not at all prepared, and the PFLP decided, we could start an uprising because most of the population of Jordan is Palestinian, and we could overthrow King Hussein and take over the country. After a while, the Jordanians began a counterattack, were pretty successful. And the Syrians came in to help the Jordanians. And at that point, they decided to move us from the house into an unfinished schoolhouse diagonally across the street. As we were zigzagging across the street, as you see in the movies, looked down the street and I don't know, pretty close. So maybe 5 tanks less. There were tanks in the street. Syrian tanks, obviously. The Palestinians had no heavy armor. And then we moved into this schoolhouse, which seemed to be a kind of strange place to have it because there was no second floor. So we were sitting on the first floor. We actually slept at a bomb shelter in the basement where it was so tight that we were shoulder to shoulder. And if you moved, you woke up everybody else. We had guards with us at all times there. Originally, we just had a guard outside. The door was locked, and there was somebody sitting outside with an automatic weapon. At one point, they tried to move us, and we ended up in a truck full of fighters, and were taken to the city Mafraq, and we drove into sort of like a bay. It was 3 walls, nothing there except 3 walls. And I was thinking Valentine's Day massacre. They were going to take us out there and line us up against the wall and kill us, which is the same thought I had when we left, because when we left the plane, we had to go through the Jordanian lines. There was the 2 planes at that point. The 3rd plane was much later in the week. Couldn't have been too much later. It was only 1 week. So the plane was surrounded by PFLPers, who in turn were surrounded by Jordanian army. You couldn't see them. They were far enough apart, but everybody knew they were there. We had to go through them. And every time we stopped behind a sand dune, because the driver was driving with his lights out to avoid detection, I felt, this is it. They're going to take us out. They're going to kill us here. The sand will cover us. They're never going to find our bodies. It's a huge desert. And my concern was really not that I was going to get killed, but that if they never found my body, my wife would never be able to remarry. She'd be a chained woman, an aguna in Hebrew, and that's it. Until they found my body, if they ever found my body, she wouldn't be able to remarry. That was a bigger concern than dying, I think. Eventually, they actually gave us a radio. I was the radio person, but they took it away hour on the hour. I think one important distinction between being a hostage then and being a hostage now is even there was no 24-hour radio. There was no 24-hour TV. News was something that was once an hour, and the TV stations didn't broadcast past midnight. So there was no news. There was no CNN. There was no Fox, and therefore, in contrast today, there were no protests, there were no marches, there were even not even prayers in the synagogue, except perhaps in a couple of them where they knew that they had congregants on the plane. So it was a completely different situation than what we have today. So that's basically the sketch. We actually, while we're being held in this unfinished schoolhouse, it was improved because now we had a bathroom in the middle. It was enclosed, but there still was just a hole in the ground. While we were sitting there and had the radio on, listening to the Voice of America broadcasting from Rhodes in our basic 500-word vocabulary, and the announcement was made that President Nixon, on his way to meet Marshal Tito, right, in Yugoslavia, had stopped off in Rome to greet the hostages. who were now all released. Of course, we didn't know what hostages they were talking about, because first day they hijacked 4 planes, 2 of which they took to the desert, 1 of which they took to Cairo after a stop in Beirut and blew up, and the 4th one was an El Al plane, in which the purser on the plane killed one of the hijackers, who was an American, by the way, who was fighting with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and decided to switch to the PFLP. And his companion was the world famous Layla Khalid, who has squares named for her all over Scandinavia and in South Africa, and is an important member of the government of the Palestinians in the West Bank, the PA. So I was sort of stunned by the announcement that all the hostages had been freed, and I said to one of the guards, I need to send a telegram to the American embassy. Meanwhile, back in the States, my wife and my in-laws were told that there is a discrepancy of 6 between the manifest of the plane and the people who were freed. However, we assumed that those 6 were hijackers. Okay, now I'm a hijacker too. So just to talk about, if you have any, want to lead me anywhere with this, Steve, just come in and ask me. There's all kinds of problems aside from no food for the Jews. Basically, we lived on pita and hard-boiled eggs. After a while, the other guys were force-feeding me. I couldn't look at another hard-boiled egg. There had been a strike early on, maybe not so early. Let me take a look when the strike was. There was one morning I woke up when we were in Irbid, I guess on the 18th, and 17th actually, I think. And one of the guys said, "Turn on the Jerry Lake to turn on the light." I went and hit the switch, and nothing happened. So I did it again, nothing happened, and they all start quibbling with each other. And I finally said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, during the night there was a strike on the transformer, and the sky lit up, and there was this incredible explosion, and the 5 of us were looking out the window, and you never got up, and we figured you were afraid and were hiding under your blanket." And I had just slept right through it. They couldn't understand how it was humanly possible, but at that point, there was no electricity, which means the stores were closed. There was no refrigeration where we were. It's obviously the same thing we've all experienced, power failures. And that was it. So we were just restricted to whatever they could do. Again, there's no refrigeration in any of the stores, so this food's going to be spoiling. And we basically were living on pita, which I was getting staler. Well, I guess they were baking because that would be baked in gas, and the hard-boiled eggs till they ran out. So I lost around 20-25 pounds during the course of our stay. On the plane, it wasn't too much better. People on the plane, which consisted of, by the end of the week, periodically people had been released from the plane from friendly countries. The men were taken off the plane in small groups and placed in Palestinian refugee camps. And at the end, the plane, by the way, had been wired with explosives. On Friday night, there were only women and children on the plane. They set up a rotating guard just to have somebody awake to see what was going to happen. The next morning, was Shabbat, the women and children were taken off the plane and taken into Amman. Our guards showed us a picture of the Sunday Arabic paper. While the brothers could speak Arabic fluently, it's the language of their home, they couldn't read or write it. So they showed us a newspaper of the planes being blown up. This is on the just same week as the hijacking. And picture of planes just And when I asked, well, what about the passengers? They just said, like, well, we killed them. And I said, you killed all the passengers? And they just wouldn't say anything. So from that day until I saw my wife at Kennedy, Erev Rosh Hashanah, I had no idea if my wife and daughter were alive. And conversely, they had no idea if I was alive because nobody knew anything. And we could not understand that, actually, that even after we were transferred from the PFLP to the Jordanian army and taken into Amman, we were met by the American ambassador, Vice President TWA, and it was a pretty simple question to ask: are our families alive? Of the 6 of us, aside from the 2 Defense Department fellows, the rest of us had family. The State Department rep had his wife, and I had my wife and daughter, and the brothers had their families, their mother, who was elderly, and their wives and children on the plane. So what's so hard to say? Yes, they when they blew up the plane, they blew up the passengers too, or just to say, yeah, they're all well, but they never said a thing. In contrast, when my wife was released after leaving Amman, they flew to Nicosia, and she was able to speak to her sister in Israel and her parents in the States, and then went to Athens and then flew to the States, where she was greeted, by the way, by 250 people at Kennedy. So that is the long and short of it. The dynamics of being a hostage are just very difficult, which not only is your situation difficult, but first of all, if you're by yourself, it's really going to drive you nuts because you have no idea what's happening in the world and there's no one to talk to. If you're with other people, you have to be able to have something in common to talk about. The non-Jews spent a lot of time talking about restaurants around the world, which obviously, observing dietary laws, I had no interest in, aside from the fact that I never went to fancy restaurants anyway. And so it's...
Did you have a dialogue with your captors, the PFLP terrorists that were holding you? Did any of them, first of all, know English? And secondly, was there any dialogue between you, the captives, and they, the captors?
Yes. So it would have been even more difficult if no one spoke English. The captain spoke excellent English. There were some of our guards who spoke English well. These were not peasants. One of them was an 18-year-old from Gaza who was trying to read Marx in Arabic, and just eventually the book was like bigger than the Manhattan telephone directory, and he just took it and threw it across the room at one point. But yeah, we had dialogue with them. There was also one guard who was perhaps around 50 and was born in Haifa and spoke perfect Hebrew, who would always come in and speak Hebrew to me. Not to the brothers, because obviously they had Israeli passports. And he kept telling me, I know you speak Hebrew. And I just stared off into space every single time. And he obviously, his facial expression was always nasty. I think he would have liked to have taken us out and shot us. The other guards were just basically doing their jobs. I know we spoke about this a little bit, about calling them terrorists. Again, I know from the very first time that one of the early times that we spoke at a ZOA convention, that when I finished, someone said, well, you didn't call your guards terrorists. And I said, well, the guys who hijacked the plane, the man and woman who hijacked the planes, the 5 planes that they hijacked over the course of the week, they were terrorists because they were threatening the lives of all the people who were on those planes. If any of the planes had had a bad landing, everybody would have been killed. Even we would have been killed, because when the second plane came in behind us in Dawson Field in the desert, they didn't tell the pilot, the Swiss airplane, there was a plane in the ground. He had to throw the engines into reverse, and he only stopped about 30 yards from our plane. He had two planes full of jet fuel collided. That would have killed all the people on the planes. The guards, for whatever reason, I considered to be in a separate category because they felt they was just doing their job. So we did have conversations with them, never anything personal other than they would tell us, at least in one case, where they lived. Other than the fellow from Haifa, I'm sure that none of them had ever been in Israel. So you can go to the absurd that at one point I asked if they could get us a deck of cards, and we were going to play bridge, but one of the guys, I think the older Defense Department guy, didn't want to play. So we actually taught one of the guards how to play bridge, and we were playing bridge with one of our guards. So I would say that they hated King Hussein more than they hated Israelis. One of them described to me how if they caught Hussein, they would roast him on a spit and eat his flesh. And looking at his eyes, it was not a metaphor. This was something that he would have done. Recalled to mind, I don't know if that happened before or after, but the defense minister or the foreign minister of Jordan was in Cairo, and he was assassinated by a Palestinian. And rather than try to escape, the assassin fell on the body and drank the blood of the Jordanian, which I had to try to escape.
So you were there during the Black September Uprising.
Right.
You were there when most of the slaughter was taking place, whether it was Palestinians and Jordanians or Jordanians in defense slaughtering Palestinians.
Right.
And were they talking about that to you, the captives?
No, other than the fact that we knew that there was fighting. And I think when they tried to move us, the other people who were being held in Palestinian refugee camps near Amman. They couldn't get through because of the fighting. There were also 15,000 Iraqi troops there because the leader of Iraq, I think he was a prince, maybe he was a king, King Hussein, was the cousin of Hussein, and so he sent in troops. We encountered Iraqis twice, once a single one at a checkpoint that was manned by the Iraqis, and then outside a fort where it was controlled by the Iraqis. Irbid itself was controlled by the Popular Front and not by the Jordanian government. Basically, there's and people want to get all the details of the book, Terror in Black September, by David Raab, which covers all the people who were on the plane who were held in various locations. And the book couldn't be published for 30 years because, in contrast to today, when the United States government is trying to make a separate deal for the American hostages that were being held in Gaza, then the United States and Israel were the only countries, because again, this was a UN kind of plane in terms of the people who were on it. There were conferences that were held in Europe, and the United States and Israel were the only two countries that said all or none. Otherwise, the British were interested in the British hostages, and the French and the whoever else was on the plane. We want our people. It was only the U.S. and Israel who said all or none. And basically, Israel didn't. There was no one on the plane, or either of the planes, a Swiss airplane also. The third plane was that in the desert. The fifth plane that was hijacked because Layla Khalid was in a British prison being treated like the Queen of England. So they felt they needed more British hostages, so they hijacked the plane where all the passengers were Arab students heading for school in London. And you had a whole collection of people, and only the United States and Israel held out for everybody to get out. which eventually happened, but it took quite a while. We
I'd
were
like to
there.
I'd
Go
like to
ahead.
take you in a different direction. If you could share with us, the emotional impact on your wife, Rivka, on yourself, on your daughter, how it shaped your family, how it shaped the last 55 years of your life is a consequence of those experiences.
Yeah, again, I think um, each person has his or her own experience uh, with an event like that. It's sort of like surviving an automobile accident or fire or whatever. In that, I when David Rabb was writing his book, we were in constant communication because he obviously was not with us and we weren't with him. And he would say, so, what happened here, what happened then? And many years later, with the last couple of years, I said to him, David, um, did your family discuss the hijacking? He was the oldest of his family. He was 16. He had a somewhat similar situation. His father had flown back to America to officiate at a wedding, and his mother and he and his four siblings were on the plane. So again, a situation where you had someone who's part of family and has part of family held, and someone who's in a safe place. So he said, yeah, they talked about it all the time. We never spoke about it. And in fact, we never mentioned it to our daughter, Natalia, until she came home from school, Kadima school, which and she said, well, the second or third grade, and she said that one of our classmates told her that some bad men had taken us and put us in a prison. And she said, is that true? And that's when we decided we had to sit down and tell her. Interestingly enough, just aside from that, my wife was interrogated and taken off the plane, and all the luggage was removed, and they were going through it and stealing things. And when everything that was made in Israel was taken, along with my wife's contacts, lenses, and a copy of my dissertation, I hope they made somebody read it because it really is boring. And so when one of the terrorists took my tallis, which my wife had given me as an engagement gift, my wife ripped it out of his hands and said, you can't have this. This is my husband's prayer shawl. You said you were against Israel and not against the Jews. When I heard the story when we spoke one time, I almost passed out because it's a lot easier to get another tallis than another wife. In addition to that, they took some jewelry that she had made for Talia and her, at that time, her two older cousins, and a tie clip that was made for her nephew. When she was released, she actually stole those back as they were leaving. She was leaving the plane. She sought them out on a little counter and grabbed them and took them. She was obviously nuts. She gave the necklaces to her nieces. She didn't give Talia her necklace till Talia was 16, which I couldn't understand, but she felt she had to be at an age where she could understand it, what had happened. So I think my wife, people say, well, how long did it take you to recover? And the answer is you never really recover. Some people do. I think some people can blot out the experience, but it's always there. Obviously, dreaming about it, when it was first released, I constantly dreamt about it. I was always being killed and trying to write my name in blood, or maybe somebody would be able to take a picture of it and they'd be able to use that as evidence that I was actually dead so my wife could remarry if she was alive. But scenarios of being on the plane, being in Irbid, all these memories flooded back, and it's like a continuous loop that was playing. And it still happens. Obviously, after October 7, those memories come back, and I think it's true of many of the people who are on the plane. In those days, a great difference. In those days, nobody recommended that people who had had a harrowing experience should seek therapy. and it may have well have helped. Now everybody goes to therapy. In those days, it just, hey, you got off the plane, you went back and resumed your life when you got back to the States, to the extent that you could. Also want to mention, perhaps parenthetically, that an inordinate number of people who were on our plane made Aliyah. David Raab's brother, we were recently interviewed by a reporter for Times of Israel, and we're reading what each other said. And he said that now, actually, he was saying he was waking up screaming after October 7 with nightmares. But he said that when he was at the airport after they were released, and it was the American ambassador and the Israeli ambassador. The American ambassador explained to them why they were hijacked because of Israel's ill treatment of the Palestinians, whereas the Israeli ambassador was giving gifts, and he said, "I'm in the wrong line," and a number of members of his family made Aliyah. So, processing it is different. I think my wife suffered for the rest of her life. For some reason, there was a hostage situation just about every year for the first couple of years. There was the Attica uprising. Interestingly enough, the only people who were involved outside the prison were the families of the guards and the families of the prisoners at Attica prison. And then there was a kidnapping by the Radical Party in Quebec of a member of either the national government or the Quebec government who was killed. And then there was a Sabina hijacking, and every time there was a hijacking, my wife sat and rocked. And again, there was no news every 10 seconds, still no CNN, no Fox. And she would sit and rock, which is exactly what her mother did, as her mother was waiting for information about her daughter and her son-in-law and her granddaughter. Sat and rocked and just was fixated, waiting for the next news report to come on. I think my daughters have been affected too. She was 2 years old, but when she woke up that morning after I was taken away, she wouldn't let my wife out of her sight, and she never said the word Abba. She never asked where I was. She just realized that something had changed. And when my wife came back to Buffalo to be with her parents while I was being held, one of the chapters in David's book is about me, and it says, am I leaving one child or two, one orphan or two? And actually it would have been three, because my wife actually was pregnant. In those days, you didn't know that early. And my wife was pregnant with twins, and she started to bleed. She went to the hospital, and she passed tissue, and they told her that she had lost the baby, and she felt that was her last connection to me, was that child that was inside of her. Subsequently, she went to the obstetrician, gynecologist, and he said, "You know what? You're still pregnant." And she begged him, "Save this baby." And that turned out to be our daughter Yael, who was obviously on the plane as an embryo. So Talia, I think, was affected by that. When you just realized that there's something different about your parents than there about other people. Just want to mention that I felt when I was in Irbid that I was in Jordanian occupied Eretz Israel. My mother was fifth generation, born in Sfat. Her family came over in the 1750s or so. My father was second generation, born in Jerusalem. His grandfather came over in around 1870. So I was a Palestinian, a real Palestinian. My parents were born in Palestine. They were Palestinians. My mother's passport, when she made her only visit back to Israel with my father in the summer of 1970, her passport said Safed Israel. My father's passport, they wouldn't put down Jerusalem, Israel. They still will not put down that if you're born in Jerusalem, you cannot have Jerusalem, Israel in your passport. You can have Jerusalem, Palestine. You can have just Jerusalem, but you cannot have, because the United States Supreme Court has ruled that the government is entitled to not put Israel in a passport to this very day. So I felt, one other thing I want to mention is that I never asked the question, why me? Even though my 5 compatriots always wanted to know why they picked you. Certainly, there was a distinguished rabbi in the plane, but I think they probably thought that he was too elderly to take. But why me? I never thought, why me? Because I said, why not me? I am a Jew. I'm a Zionist. My parents were born in Israel. Who better to take as a hostage than me? Not that I was an important person, but I represented something. So yeah, I obviously it had a deep effect on us when Tali was chosen to. There was some kind of convention of Jewish youth in Israel, and Tali was selected to represent upstate New York. And my wife and I sat down to say, can we let her go? And finally, we said we can't put our trauma on her any more than it already is. And we told her, yeah, you can certainly go. However, when we said goodbye at the airport, as a Kohen, as a Jewish priest, I wanted to give her the priestly blessing, and I couldn't finish it. It was a traumatic moment. Now I have a son in Israel and his 4 kids, and I worry about them, my daughter-in-law all the time. So yeah, your perspective is a little bit different based on your life experience.
I know every hostage situation is radically different one from the other. And as you said, within any hostage situation, the experience and the response to it is different. If you were able to speak to families of hostages, if you were able to speak to the hostages that have been let out and please God will be redeemed, what would you share with them?
It'd be very hard because I think each person has their own individual situation. I think there are relatives of the hostages who have the hostages as their primary focus. They're not focusing on Hamas at all. They're not focusing on the war. They're not focusing on the end game. It's just, I want my family member or my good friends back. And then there are those who are detached, let's say in the military. I heard 2 officers say that the primary objective is the destruction of Hamas and the hostages are secondary. And this is the problem that the Israeli government faces. Obviously, as I mentioned, there were no protests when our group was being held. Not just the 6 of us, but all the other hostages that were spread all over the refugee camps. So it's a different world. But
so I'm actually asking that question on an emotional level, not on a political level.
I'd say one thing is that relatives and friends of the hostages are always imagining the worst. And hopefully they're wrong. And the situations, depending upon where individual hostages are being held, it's not that bad. You have to be prepared for the fact that the person who comes home, and we all pray that they'll come home soon, is going to be a different person than the person before October 7th. You just change. Some people just a little bit. So it was interesting that when we had a 50th anniversary Zoom, that one of the participants was 16 years old in the plane. And at the end, he said, I found this very interesting because I remember getting on the plane in Israel and getting off the plane in New York. And I have no recollection of anything that happened in between. So as long as he was held, that was all a blank in his head. Maybe that's a good thing for him, have it blanked out. But each case is really an individual case. You could have 2 siblings that are being held, they're going to respond differently. afterwards. You just have to give people space and give people chizuk, give people strength, and just tell them that they're with them, or whatever they need, you're going to try and give them. But there's no prescription, there's no book that's written. I think, in fact, I was thinking about this morning, that I'm not sure what it was in 1970 with the two fellows from the Defense Department who were working in hostile territory, but I'm sure in the military now, they're very conscious of training people about what you can say, what you can't say, and providing therapy for people who get out. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just very difficult. You just have to sort of like take baby steps. You can't expect the person who's coming back to you is the same person that you last saw.
Dr. Berkowitz, we want to thank you. We know this is not particularly easy. We know this is bringing up memories that go back, memories of very challenging times. We want to thank you for your insight, also for your perspective, giving us a sense, of just the long-lasting impact of what it means to be a hostage and the impact on the rest of your life. Really, we're very grateful to you. We want to wish you a very, very meaningful summer. Together, we all pray for the benefit of the hostages, for the benefit of the hostage families.
I just want to mention that the T-shirt that I'm wearing says 12 reasons why I like to be called a Saba, and it has pictures of my 12 grandchildren who wouldn't have been born had my wife and I not survived the hijacking.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you for having me.